Hello and welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Historical Humans podcast. My name is Justin Woods, and I'm joined today by my fellow co-hosts Colum Coleman and Aaron Gilpin. And today we are marching to the deep south. We are headed our way down to the sea, and we're gonna stop at a bunch of sites along the way and discuss them. Right, guys?
I got
Yep,
the tinder boxes.
yep, that's right. Today's episode takes us all the way back to the Civil War, or as it's known anywhere outside of America, the U.S. Civil War. Um,
The
so
War
far,
of
the one and
Northern
only.
Aggression.
Do not say those
What
words,
was
Justin.
that?
People will take you seriously. All right.
Okay, yes, that is a good point. That is a meme. We will talk about the revisionist side of things as well during this, but
All I'm
Yeah,
saying is, for what they call it that, yet they're the ones who fired first, not
yep.
just on
But
Fort Sumter, but along the border with a bunch of raids.
states'
yeah,
rights,
but
just
States'
do
rights
some
to
we're
what?
not.
Vikings.
We're not here to discuss. We're not here to. You gave me one job, and I'm going to do it.
We're
We
going
are
to show
not
you what
here to
happens when you
discuss.
fight for those states' rights, and it's Sherman.
We are we are here to discuss one man and one campaign within this war. It is not anything to do with the cause of the war, but it has a lot to do with the outcome. We will be discussing Sherman's March to the Sea, one of the most brutally effective military campaigns of the war.
And one that all three of us have a very tangential connection to, which I can't wait to talk about.
Yeah, we get to talk about in a minute.
Yeah.
So, the U.S. Civil War lasted from 1861 to 1865. Sherman's March to the Sea lasted 37 days, from November 15th to December 21st of 1864. So, this is the final months of the war.
I didn't
Uh,
realize this was not even 2 months. I thought
Oh
it was
yeah,
a
yeah,
no,
lot longer.
it's 37 days. It is undertaken by the Union's Major General William Sherman, and he was tasked with marching from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia, which is about 285 miles. So he made pretty decent time for going on foot.
I guess it helps when you burn everything in your path.
Yeah, yeah. The March to the Sea is a scorched earth campaign, and what that means is that its purpose was to damage the South's ability to wage war and to cause as much psychological trauma as possible. As Sherman moves throughout the state of Georgia, he goes around burning the plantations of the wealthy and anything that can be classified as war supplies, primarily food sources, because this is a southern state during the Civil War. It is known for its agricultural output in terms of both plantations and actual food.
Yeah,
So
but wasn't
he's
most of their economy like fueled as for cash crops? Like, wasn't that one of the big
yep.
issues?
oh
So,
it
like,
That
whatever
is
food stores they had already.
Yeah, that's one of the big
Ooh,
issues. There was basically two things in Georgia. There were massive wealthy plantations full of cash crops, primarily cotton, and there were smaller, more subsistence-based ranching going on. These would be just smaller farms run by less wealthy folk that generally helped feed the population, even if they couldn't do it all by themselves. This is the 1860s, so places like Ohio and Missouri are very much the breadbasket of America. But if it's there, it burns. Yeah. Uh, his campaign is considered one of the most successful acts of total war in history, and arguably the first and most successful act of total war in modern history.
oh that one is a spicy
Yeah,
one because there's definitely
yeah,
people that are not going to agree with that. But with
yeah.
Sherman and with the American context, this is one of the first examples where Americans are involved, where we really got a taste for, as messed up as it is, we got the taste for blood. And I feel
We
like that
watched
same mentality went into the trenches with the shotguns.
about 50 years prior, we watched the same thing. We watched something similar happen in Russia with Napoleon, and we're like, what if instead of retreating, we were going forward and attacking?
I
Yeah,
mean,
but
to the same degree, though, the British did sack DC and they razed most of it.
We did get
mhm,
them back. We
yeah,
did get them back.
yeah,
Same
but
war, but we did get them back.
yeah,
Eventually.
yeah. The Now the reason why this is considered an act of total war is because total war is defined as when an army accepts that any cost is acceptable to achieve its goal.
The ends justify the means.
Yeah, we will,
Why do I see the
it's
sun?
often painted
Oh no.
in a defensive light of we will endure any hardship in order to attain victory. However, in practice, it's we will commit any atrocity in order to attain victory. And one of the key sticking points with why Sherman's March to the Sea is such a prime example of total war is that even though Georgia is in rebellion, it's still technically a part of the United States of America, which means he is effectively setting fire to his own country in an effort to defeat the Confederacy.
No, no, no. They weren't their own country. This is like harsh parenting 101. Like, oh, you
No,
want to be independent? Oh, you want to be on your own? Well, congratulations. Now
My
you got to
favorite thing.
figure it out.
no,
My
no,
favorite
no,
thing about that
I
is
didn't say they were
like
their own. I said Sherman is setting fire to his own nation
I know.
in order to suppress the Confederacy.
I think it's really interesting that uh he didn't I don't think he really viewed them as because there's the idea that it's framed as brother against brother, like the whole Civil War. I Sherman's just kind of proof that was not it.
Let's also, I do want to highlight the fact, and we talked about this a little bit beforehand, but what by this point in the war, by the time we reached this level, so many things have happened. The Battle of Gettysburg, the Battle of Shiloh, the Battle of Bull Run 1 and 2.
Charleston,
There were a
Yeah,
lot of very
Vicksburg.
significant, yeah, a lot of very significant battles, and even
yeah,
Sherman with Shiloh. That's where Sherman actually rose to prominence within the U.S. Army. Is that at the Battle of Shiloh, he remained unwavering, even though the Union was caught totally unprepared and totally off guard during the attack. And one of the things that Sherman did was he managed to rally his troops, and in some feat of heroism and probably a little bit of myth thrown in, during the Battle of Shiloh on the second day, he had three horses shot out from underneath him. He took injuries to his hand and his shoulder and still managed to survive. This man was like, you
Too
can
angry
knock
to
me down,
die.
but you can't
yeah,
kill me.
He was just
yeah.
literally
It's
too angry to die. He just was just like Confederate soldiers will not kill me.
And because
yeah,
of that, he was
it's
instantly
yeah,
promoted.
it's a yeah the yeah Sherman at Shiloh is sort of a death of Blackbeard kind of mythos. Blackbeard is famous for in the final battle where he is slain. He took 5 muskets and 20 sword blows to kill him.
Or like
Uh,
Rasputin, who took
so
a
it's
literal
it's kind of like
appetite.
that, except Sherman doesn't die. Sherman becomes an absolute monster.
Sherman's like, I
Yeah,
take that and I accept the challenge.
yeah,
He was just like,
yeah.
and I took
So
these wounds personally, so I
yeah,
made it the entire Confederacy's problem.
I like to imagine, for the sake of flair, that it was like a small like bruise or scrape on his shoulder, and he just kind of like grazed a bullet on his shoulder, or a small graze on his hand and the bullet in the shoulder, and he's just like, it's over. We're going to war.
So
so
you've chosen death.
So speaking of that, let's watch a little bit here of Sherman's transformation into the Doomslayer, because
Oh, he is the Doomslayer of the Confederacy.
yeah, because there is a lot of key pretexts for why the march very specifically happens from Atlanta to Savannah, and that is that in on September 1st of 1864, Sherman ends the siege of the city of Atlanta and takes the city. Atlanta being the central hub for manufacturing, supplies, railroads. Basically, it's the heart of Georgia as far as anything military or industrial is concerned. And it's kind of the beginning of the end for the Confederate presence here. However, the Confederate response to the fall of Atlanta really pisses Sherman off. See, the Confederate decides to send a Confederate general by the name of John Hood with his cavalry to swing around the now captured Atlanta and just harass everything Union it can find. And Sherman spends the entire month of October futilely chasing down General Hood. It gets to the point that Sherman drives Hood to retreat into Alabama, where Hood then turns to attack Tennessee, specifically attempts to capture Nashville. And
so he pulled Skip, or no, he pulled what was his name?
Yeah.
The Roman general, the Roman consul. It started with an F. Who he did that to Hannibal.
there's like, okay, I'm doing it.
Which
Was Africanus?
No, because Scipio was
Hannibal,
in Spain
anyway.
at that time.
But for context and for reference, the conquest of Atlanta was a serious death blow for the Confederacy, because not only was Atlanta one of the largest cities in the South at this time, one of the largest population bases, but it also was home to a massive hub for rail network. And during the war, rail and ships, specifically rivers, were massive for fast troop movements. So the Union and the Confederacy fought tooth and nail over almost every rail hub. That's why you saw a lot of cities like Vicksburg, like Corinth, like God, how many others? Because they were fighting over control of the rail to move troops and supplies.
And the Mississippi River was another big one, right?
Hotbed, yeah.
Yeah,
Mississippi, the Tennessee, the Ohio were three major rivers.
Yeah, and one of the key things too with Atlanta specifically is that if you happen to hold Atlanta and Savannah, which are the beginning and end points of this march, you can cut off Richmond, the capital and center of the fighting for the Confederacy, from most of its supply chain.
Yeah, because didn't Sherman, after taking Savannah, marched up towards Charleston?
He does spend the war after completing the march in South Carolina. However, by the time the march is completed, the remainder of the war can be measured in months.
Okay, fair.
Yeah, they end, and by that time, the Union and
right. That's because the Confederacy's capital was in Georgia, right?
The Confederacy's capital was in Virginia, and this blow here is so massively demoralizing and so very critical to their war efforts that even though they probably could have held out for a little longer, they choose not to.
Fair.
Kind of a fun aside on that, 2 points that I'd like to make is at the conclusion of the war, the place where they signed the treaty, the official end of the war, was owned by the gentleman whose farmland was the start of the Civil War.
Yeah.
Oh my God, that's right.
Broke out on his farm, so he's like, "Screw this! I am moving so far away that I should not be bothered." And then the war ended in his living room.
Yeah. Start of the conflict, end of the war. It's like the man who was at both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You can only have so much bad luck.
Which kind of interesting. One of the things I was looking at earlier today, kind of ironically, I guess, was looking at depictions of the signing of the treaty, because a lot of different artists have a lot of different interpretations. One of the biggest discrepancies is the placement and who is seated at both this square table and this round table, and the location of that. And one of the interesting things is we talk a lot about revisionist history. Certain people tended to end up in the later renditions. Certain folks got a higher rank than what they originally were.
But yeah, but back to before the treaty is signed. We Sherman after he chases Hood out of Georgia, he sees Hoods everywhere. He realizes this is a viable strategy for the Confederacy to bog us down here. He recognizes that no. I wasted an entire month and achieved no military objectives. The best I can hope for is a stalemate if things remain the same. And so, because he is convinced of this, he believes that any attempt to hold southern land is futile, and we should not attempt to hold territory. So he shifts his tactics from besieging cities and capturing ground to raiding. And he sends a proposal to his boss at the time, Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, suggesting that we should create a barrier of ruined infrastructure, a line of broken roads and damaged rails, such the likes of which the Southern forces cannot easily cross, and form a massive sandbag hurdle to prevent reinforcements getting into the Carolinas and Virginia, where most of the fighting is taking place. He wants to, yeah. He wants, and he lists out several key goals. The first of which is we must cut from Atlanta to Savannah in order to basically use the Appalachian Mountains and the Atlantic Ocean as a barricade.
Literally severing most of the South supply line. So, massive strategic victory. But man, is
it would this cuts off the Confederate forces in Virginia and the Carolinas from the Confederacy, while still allowing the Union to launch assaults into Alabama and Mississippi from Tennessee, which was held by the Union. So it does nothing to impede the Union's ability to launch attacks behind the broken railway system, and does everything to prevent the Confederacy from reinforcing its primary strongholds.
And then you go on to talk about the actual capital that was lost, where during the march to the sea, Sherman and his men specifically targeted warehouses, barns, grain silos, for the pure purpose of destroying the food crop. And during this time, the South was still exporting cotton to trade partners in Europe. It was one of the only ways they were able to finance the war. They were selling their cotton at dirt cheap rates to England, France.
Yeah. There's if you look at a lot of Civil War war songs from the Union, there's a number of ones which makes threat to a man named John Bull. That was code for the English.
All I'm saying is the English sided with the wrong side during that war.
Yeah, they tend to do that. Anyway, now Grant receives Sherman's proposal on October 9th, and Grant had been charged that spring with breaking the Confederate war machine, and he's under pressure. It's been half a year, and all he has to show for it is Atlanta, which is a great prize, but it's far from the total destruction of the Confederates' ability to fight back that he has been charged with completing. So, on November 7th, he approves this march. Sherman's troops prepare to move out on November 10th. They begin by setting fire to the military-industrial complex within Atlanta, and then they celebrate by setting fire to the rest of Atlanta the next day. And this is the beginning of a large obsession with arson that will follow this army for the next month.
They're just like, what's a really efficient way? Hey guys, how do we make sure we don't get lost along the way? Well, do we leave a trail maybe? Okay, good idea. Yeah. Well, we don't have enough rope or enough yarn. What's an easier way to do it? Hey,
breadcrumbs?
Johnson, Put that cigarette out. Oh, come on, man. You're burning this. Oh, boy.
Yeah, they burn. It just all burns. Just yeah, yeah. 40% of
Yeah.
Atlanta burns down as a result of
Oh.
this, and Sherman, and that's in part because Sherman's army doesn't stop until they leave on November the 16th, 5 days later. So they spend about a week just setting fire to the largest city in Georgia.
Like I said, not only the largest city in Georgia, but one of the largest cities in the South, one of the
Yep.
major supply lines, one of the major
Yep.
rail hubs. Like, we
Yep.
cannot understate how important Atlanta is. This is, I would almost argue, the equivalency of like World War II when the Allies were marching on Munich, marching on Dresden, marching on Berlin, where it's just like, you are in the heartland, you are in enemy territory.
Yeah. Yeah. In terms of like, I guess just output and importance, this would be the equivalent of nuking San Francisco and annihilating all of Silicon Valley.
Just because you
Is
are
that
upset
last
at
part really?
California.
Isn't it? I mean, do we really need Silicon Valley?
Okay, yeah, I
I'm just
understand that's a
I'm just
valid point,
in,
but it's
in terms of like technically being the heart of industry, yeah,
I mean,
it's the heart of technology for America.
the way I see it, Sherman said, "Wow, that's a nice city you got there. Be ashamed if something happened to it."
I mean,
I
we
just
can't say we can't say this is the equivalent of setting fire to Detroit. Detroit's already on fire.
uh,
Has been for 20
it
years.
just it very much highlights one the point at the war that we were at by the time that this had happened. There had already been almost 500,000 casualties by this point. There had been so much bloodshed, so many horrific battles, and at this point it had reached a point where both sides of the army were exhausted, they were depleted. It's hard to continue that morale, and honestly, for the part that it played in terms of this war, this was a very decisive blow for the Union because of how close to home it hit for a lot of people, and just this sheer scale of destruction. We
Yeah,
talk World War II. This is very much equivalent to the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where just an entire city is just decimated,
yeah,
where it's just gone. Thousands of people are dead. You have tons of troops, ton of military industrial complexes. Like the scale and the sheer magnitude of this cannot be
yeah,
understated.
yeah. Just unlike Hiroshima and Nagasaki, this wasn't aiming at mountain towns. This was aiming at Tokyo.
Yeah.
But so Sherman is about to go on his march. He gets 62,000 men to do this, and he divides his army into three parts. He has Major General Oliver Howard commanding the Army of Tennessee on his right wing. He has Major General Henry Slocum, very unfortunate name, commanding the Army of Georgia on the left. And finally, he has Brigadier General Judson Kilpatrick, a man named for murder, uh, commanding the cavalry screen. And the reason he splits up his forces in what is supposed to be a sheer wall of marching from west to east is because he wants to confuse the Confederacy. He knows that they have a lot of good cavalry generals. He knows that those generals will be deployed to stop him. And he wants to get as far as possible before they realize where he's actually headed.
I mean, yeah, I guess
Yeah.
it kind of makes sense. I mean, because you don't really know which direction he might want to go. There's plenty of options, but to go straight to Savannah.
Yeah. 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 So because of this, he sends Howard to aim at Macon and Slocum to Augusta. And that gives the Confederacy two very viable targets for the Union to hit. Both of these towns are significant towns. Neither of them are actually his objective. uh, However, before we get into what he actually does, there are a few things to note with the conduct of of the march. First and foremost is Special Field Order number 120. These are the instructions for the code of conduct that Sherman issued and expected his men to follow during the march to the sea. They will not be followed.
That's a lot of words. Too bad I'm
Yep.
not gonna read them.
Yeah. Rule number 1. The act of foraging and the confiscation of livestock is strongly encouraged. We are trying to deprive the enemy of most of their food supply. Rule number 2. Home invasion is not permitted unless said home has fired upon the troops.
Hey, they shot at me. I definitely heard a gunshot.
Yeah.
That definitely wasn't like an acorn falling on a cart.
You just see someone in the back with like a cast iron pot and a stick.
Yeah.
Get down. You know?
Oh no, it's the drummer boy.
Yeah.
No!
Rule number 3. The destruction of private or industrial property is allowed only if you are engaged by Confederate forces, similar to rule number 2.
There were Confederate soldiers in that building. How can you tell now? We don't have any evidence left. It's gone.
Well,
exactly.
This does highlight one specific point, and it is kind of valid in that a lot of the battles that were in more urbanized areas, the soldiers took full advantages of the houses. People would feed them, people would house them, people would keep them in the basements. Like, it's not unrealistic to expect to be engaged by a random house.
Isn't that a violation of the Third Amendment?
No. The U.S. Constitution forbids the government mandating that you quarter soldiers in your home. However, if you of your own volition choose to pull a man off the street and feed him, that is entirely on you. The Constitution forbids the U.S. government showing up and say, "Hi, we're the 14th Infantry Brigade. Your home and food are ours now."
And like Gettysburg is a really big example because a lot of the battle was in the middle of this town where there was one guy whose family was hiding in the basement while soldiers were shooting at each other through the windows across the porch.
Yep.
That would have been a hell of a day to just be out on the porch. Like, Grandpa's just out there, just in his rocking chair, but he's deaf, right? Can't even hear anything because he's just like looking at the beautiful sunset. He's like, yes.
So, Aaron,
screaming about this ain't no real war. I was at DC in 1812.
Oh, no, I was at the Battle of New Orleans.
I was there with old Andrew Jackson.
Oh
shit.
Old Hickory.
But the guy who lived in the house after the war was over literally went and grabbed all the Confederate soldiers that were dead on his porch and buried them in his front yard.
Yeah.
Where else is he gonna put them, I guess?
Yeah, he can't use the basement. That's where he hides.
That is a nice segue to the learning about the fact that Mor Houses were created for this civil, like, because there were just so much dead that you couldn't do anything without except mass graves.
Bring out your dead.
This Crusader Kings cultural fascination, funeral homes.
Ooh.
Bring out your dead.
Rule 4 of the Special Field Order number 120. Any able-bodied black laborers you find are permitted to join you on the march and operate under this order as Union soldiers if you have enough supplies to maintain them.
Did he?
No. But that doesn't stop them from giving a ton of black people torches and aiming them at the nearest settlement.
Here, listen, we can't exactly take you on, but here's some torches.
So that's part of another thing we talked about off screen was that Sherman, for his part in the war, wasn't really a staunch abolitionist. He was more of a unionist. So when all of these freed slaves, of which there were roughly 40,000 by the end that had joined him, he did not really go out of his way to accommodate them or to make them comfortable. They were living in very poor conditions, but and this is a very strong argument, they were tasked with the impossible decision: do you continue your enslavement, or do you join this madman who's really not going to help you, but he's not going to stop you?
Yeah.
To be
Final
fair, like
numbers.
Sherman really said, I don't know what started this war, but I'm the
I'm
thing that's
gonna end
ending
it.
this war.
Yeah. He's also I believe attributed with a quote, "War is hell," mostly because he made it that way, but still.
uh,
And the final number for freed slaves at the end of this march is just under 33,000.
Whew.
Um, yeah. So this order aside, rogue units immediately break off from the main army to target Confederate civilians. These units are called bummers because it's just a real bummer that they're doing this, and I'm not going to stop it as the general in charge. um, and the reason why bummers were so tolerated by Sherman was because despite their activities being technically illegal, they furthered the goals of his march. They spread terror throughout the South. They destroyed Southern infrastructure. They made the Confederacy fear the name of the Union. And that is what Sherman wants. His primary objective is to break the Southern fighting spirit and their war machine. So, targeting civilians, burning people alive in their homes. Yeah, if I see you doing it, I'm going to yell at you. But if it happens when I'm looking the other way, oh well. And I'm
Hey,
always looking the other way.
hey, look at Sergeant Smith started quite a big bonfire. Do you hear screaming? No, no, no. It's just moisture in the wood.
It's like, sir, doesn't that sign say orphanage? Kicks down sign. What sign?
Yeah, like pushes the sign into the
Orphanage?
fire and like
What
also pulls out like a
orphanage?
hot dog.
Yeah. Now,
Oh.
the
Isn't
main.
that a hospital, sir? It was a hospital.
Yep.
Fire!
Yeah. Yep.
Or it's just like, no, that was actually an enemy military barracks. They disguised it as a hospital.
There were tunnels underneath. I promise. We saw a
Oh
calendar.
no.
Now, the main method of demoralizing the Confederacy, if you are not a bummer and going off to commit war crimes, is the public destruction of railroads. Sherman ripped up the railroads as he went along and melted them down into slag in front of whatever town it was the railroad was next passing through, for the sole purpose of showing the people there that you are cut off from the world and my sword is law.
Yeah, that again, the importance of the rail. They cut them off from trade. They cut them off from food. They cut them off from communications. Like
Yep.
a lot of telegram wires at this time also ran along the rail line, so they did that. And this was
Yep.
pure isolationism to the point where some towns in the South have never reconnected to the rail network.
Yep. It's very bad. The level of destruction that goes here. And every town he passed through that saw this knew what it meant. It meant that this town is alone now in the world. It is completely cut off from the rest of the world. And if it's happening here, it's probably happening everywhere. And this is very demoralizing, especially because, a lot of your town's sons are soldiers. Fuck. You're
My
just screwed.
my favorite part about this was how slow information transferred and transmitted. Of like it took months and sometimes weeks for information to get from point A to point B about the happenings in the war. So when he was doing this and going town to town, the only people that would know about what he was doing was the next town down the rail. Because after this town got destroyed, one person would be escape, ride their horse like hell to the next town, give them warning, and they're
Yep.
just like, he destroyed the rails. He burned down the town hospital.
Yep. Yeah, it's like really shitty Paul Revere going on,
Sherman is
except you're always too late.
Oh no! Sherman is coming. Sherman is coming. Knock knock.
Yeah. Yeah, you're running through the door. Sherman is coming. Sherman's coming. Sherman opens the door. I'm already here.
Has the torch in hand and just like flings it behind him.
Yeah. Uh, Now, Sherman's decision to split his armies to do this really confuses Confederate command. It succeeds in its goal. Confederate leadership initially thinks he's targeting Macon, then they think he's targeting Augusta. Both are wrong. And the man they dispatch, Major General Joseph Wheeler, is always one step behind him. He goes to reinforce Macon, finds out Sherman's not coming there, then heads to Augusta, finds out Sherman's not coming there. Sherman's true target, as it turns out, is Milledgeville, the state capital. So when Sherman's forces are outside Macon and Wheeler's in there going to reinforce, like, yeah, we've got this, we're going to hold the city, they immediately make a sharp turn and sack a place called Griswoldville.
Oh.
Which leads to the Battle of Griswoldville. Now, Griswoldville was a small industrial town. General Howard, who was commanding, I believe, the Army of Tennessee and the right flank of Sherman's army, burns it to the ground. There is no 40% or anything. No, the city is leveled. On November 22nd, 4,500 Confederate militia troops leave Macon and catch Howard in Griswoldville while he is still leveling the city. Howard wins the battle despite being hugely outnumbered. He has 1,500 Union troops in the ruins of Griswoldville against 4,500 Confederate militia. Now, this is where professional training and the fortified position really come into play, because he annihilates them. Because these are militia.
Which is local farm men who say, I got a rifle. I have the right to bear arms.
Yeah.
Oh, you're gonna bear some arms.
Yeah. Now, it is estimated that 1,000 of the 4,500 Confederate militia are killed to only 100 of the 1,500 Union
10 to 1.
Soldiers before the Confederacy is driven to retreat.
10 to 1's some good odds.
Yep. Things get only worse for the Confederacy as the next day, Sherman, with his left flank, hits Milledgeville. Now, Milledgeville does not put up resistance and is thus largely spared. If also for no other reason, then Sherman needs the Capitol building intact to hold a fake legislature with his soldiers as the legislators, hereby renouncing on behalf of the state of Georgia the Articles of Succession.
I love it. That is the biggest fuck you.
Yeah. And the best part is there's a poetic reason for this. There's a reason this is the reason why Sherman's left flank is the Army of Georgia. It is the Union Army of Georgia. There's a reason he put that unit here. Was so that all the Union soldiers from Georgia could openly declare, no, this document is not valid.
It's like it was written by people from Georgia. You know, when we came in, all the real legislators, they left. So, in absentee.
Yeah, we are the government. This is the like happiest and smallest military coup ever.
Very much so.
That's what it is. Sherman is taking the Army of Georgia, marching into the state legislature of Georgia, and using said army to enact legislation.
Well, and the other thing that kind of jumps out
that's one way to do it.
Is you notice that in modern day, Milledgeville is no longer the capital for Georgia.
Yep. But it was at the time. Also fire. Now, it is at this point, when he is in Milledgeville, when Sherman's in Milledgeville, that disturbing news reaches the Union Army. The day after he marches into Milledgeville, November 24th now, Union prisoners who had escaped the Confederate war crime camp of Andersonville meet up with Sherman's army. And they tell the all too true tale of what happened there. Andersonville was home to the Confederate prison for POWs. However, POWs at Andersonville were blatantly neglected and abused. The Confederacy had openly refused to properly or even at all house or feed some 30,000 people it was holding prisoner. By the time Sherman begins his march across Georgia, 12,100 people had been slaughtered due to starvation and exposure at Andersonville. Andersonville had a prisoner death rate of 29%. 29% of everyone housed at Andersonville dies in captivity. Now, the reason why we are taking a moment here to be so dark and so stark with a lot of these numbers is because there is long, even in my education, yes, I had a lot of education in southern states, been this apologetic thing stating that no one would have died at Andersonville if Sherman hadn't marched to the sea. General Sherman is the true villain of Andersonville. He is not. Andersonville will kill 12,900 people. Sherman does not begin his march to the sea until after 12,100 of them have been killed. That is 94% of the total casualties at this encampment. What's more? Yeah.
The other thing
yeah,
too
go
is
for this.
Kind of a connection. Well, not the connection I want to bring up between us, but another connection to our hometown of Chicago is it was home to Camp Douglas, which was referred to as the North's Andersonville. Yeah. However, when you look at the numbers, the deaths at Camp Douglas were a mere is somewhere between 4,200 and about 6,000. So still less than half. And actually, when you look at the grand total of deaths in POW camps, Camp Douglas had one of the lower ones, especially compared to both Andersonville and Elmira in New York.
Yeah.
So kind of a comparison there of, even at the high end of Camp Douglas, is still less than half of what was slaughtered by March.
Yeah, definitely. And so the reason why a lot of the Southerners and Southern education and whatnot likes to blame Sherman is, this is kind of the logic to it, is Sherman was burning all these, railroads, houses, plantations, supplies. And the logic is that Sherman destroyed all the supplies that were meant for Andersonville, causing the starvation. Except the starvation and the death toll occurred before Sherman ever first picked up a torch. And the logic is that without food, how could these noble Confederate soldiers care for their prisoners, who they were slaughtering in mass? What's more, there's a secondary myth that said, well, if Sherman really cared about Andersonville, why didn't he divert his troops to Andersonville? This is because that by the time Sherman hears about Andersonville, it's because it's being evacuated. That's how the escapees get to him, is because the Confederacy, not wanting Sherman to receive an influx of 30,000 angry Union soldiers, proceeds to cart them off and ship them to a half dozen other facilities. And, there's nothing like transit for people to make their great escape. By the time Sherman hears about Andersonville, its population had been reduced to about 1,500 POWs. less than, I believe that is 5% of its original capacity. So a lot of these myths are just people trying to apologize for the Confederacy and claim that this nightmare somehow isn't the fault of the people who perpetuated it. I know it's a very dark thing to talk about, but it's just something that comes up whenever you talk about this march. And of all the things that Sherman does that he deserves to probably be hated for, this is not one of them. His response to Andersonville is not a reason why this man can be regarded as a monster.
You see that a lot. I do want to kind of highlight that real quick because, despite the jokes that are made, the revisionist ideology for the Civil War is a very, very contentious one because it's something that post Civil War, there during Reconstruction, there were a lot of really negative feelings, a lot of resentment. However, it was peace was kept because they kept Union soldiers deployed down there for the next 30 years. But then at the turn of the century and at the end of the 1800s, you saw this revisionist where a lot of apologists started revering these Confederate soldiers. They started revering these ideologies. They made the arguments that it was about states' rights versus what it actually was and what every single state had said in their Articles of Succession, that it was for the preservation of the institution of slavery.
And that's not just in the Articles of Succession. That is enshrined as one of the basic human realities in the Confederacy's Constitution.
So the idea that it was just states' rights versus this, or the fact that it was the War of Northern Aggression, because they tried to frame it that the reason they had to fight was because the North was encroaching on their way of life, on their livelihoods, on their business.
Yeah.
Which wasn't the case, to be fair.
Yeah, reality is they lost an election to a guy who was neutral at best towards their policies. And that was really apparently too great an indignity for Virginia to suffer.
And it just it snowballed, and you have what was the organization? Was it I'm thinking Daughters of the Revolution, but that wasn't it. It was
Daughters of the Confederacy.
Daughters of the Confederacy, thank you. Who raised a lot of money in the South and spent years building and erecting these monuments. I mean, there's a mountainside in Georgia that has Confederate generals etched on it permanently. There's parks named after Nathan Bedford Forrest. There's monuments and statues. I mean, Richmond had a whole alleyway of monuments to these treasonous traitors. They rebelled against the Union.
Yeah, there's a 50-foot Confederate flag on the highway out of Quantico. So I remember that. I fucking saw it.
It just like this love and this ideology and this revisionist history, it really carried into the 1920s, even as recently as the 1960s at the centennial, because this history had started pervading this ideology, this almost idolization of these figures, and it truly works to negate the actual history and the actual facts of what happened. And like, don't get us wrong, we make jokes and we laugh, but Sherman's March to the Sea is a very dark topic. But the fact of the matter is, it wasn't a response to Andersonville. They were two separate incidences that are both tragic in their own rights.
Yeah. Both Andersonville and the March to the Sea are filled with villains and atrocities. They are not the same. They are not linked, except for in this one point that we are going to get to, which is the retaliatory strikes. See, Sherman's men find out about Andersonville. They are enraged. And this is where bummer activity takes a major uptick. They proceed to start targeting livestock, irregardless of where it is found. This is against the standing orders of General Sherman. And in response to this, General Wheeler of the Confederacy orders any and all Union POWs that he has executed. And Wheeler only stops killing every Union soldier who has surrendered to him when Sherman takes all the Confederate troops he has captured up to this point in the war and openly sends a message that if you kill another surrendering soldier, I will kill everyone I've captured. And I have more people than you. But beyond that, beyond this like retaliatory murdering of each other's POWs, most of which was again committed by the Confederacy with General Wheeler, Andersonville does not play a role in the March to the Sea. What does play a role is Wheeler's cavalry, who at this point really start going. They start getting some momentum on them at about the same time that Sherman finds out about Andersonville. Sherman finds out on the 24th, and on the 25th of November, Wheeler's cavalry starts scoring victories for the Confederacy. Rapid transition out of Andersonville, but let's get back on the war because we're going to stay in a dark hole forever.
Alrighty.
That's true, yeah.
Yeah. So Wheeler targets the left flank and engages General Slocum at Sandersonville on the 25th and 26th. He then engages Kilpatrick's Union cavalry at Buckhead Creek on November the 28th. All of these engagements are minor Confederate victories. He gives worse than he gets. He takes prisoners, whom he then executes inside of Union troops, and he generally drives off the Union cavalry and slows the march of the left flank. However, he isn't able to significantly delay Sherman because Sherman is moving in 2 units, and Wheeler is moving in 1. There is a major cavalry battle at Waynesboro between Kilpatrick and Wheeler on December the 4th, in which the Union wins a decisive victory and is able to more or less clear the road ahead to Savannah. However, we're going to take a dark turn again.
Can it get much darker? What the hell?
Yes, it is. We're going to witness the most definite slaughter of shall we say emancipated civilians.
Emancipated?
Yeah.
5 days. 5 days after the Battle of Waynesboro drives off Wheeler's cavalry, he's back again at Ebenezer Creek. Now, everything we've talked about so far has been referred to as a battle. Ebenezer Creek is referred to as the tragedy of Ebenezer Creek. Because on December the 9th, the 14th Corps of the army under Sherman's command is struck by Wheeler's cavalry while attempting to cross a recently flooded river. Now, the 14th Corps had fallen behind Sherman's army due to its dedication to leading formerly enslaved African Americans to safety. They did not have enough supplies, and they did not have the ability to maintain marching formation with so many freed slaves marching within their ranks. During the crossing of Ebenezer Creek, the 14th Corps was forced to destroy the only bridge over the creek to prevent Wheeler from crossing it, killing them, and running down their fellow, the rest of the army, which was half a day or more's march ahead, which is nothing for the cavalry to make up. So, to save the army, they had to sacrifice all the civilians that were following along with them.
Ooh.
Because of the destruction of the bridge, most of the black civilians traveling with the 14th Corps were left to the mercy of Wheeler's cavalry. The majority were killed trying to cross the flooded river. The rest were captured, Their fates remain unknown. There is no known instance of a member of a black civilian traveling with the 14th Corps resurfacing at the end of this war, implying that Wheeler said, "Hang on, these aren't technically Union soldiers." Which means technically I don't break the standing truth with Sherman if they all die.
Not to mention that this was a fairly common practice among the Confederate Army at that time, where
Yeah.
they viewed any formerly enslaved people as lost property, and that it was better dead than freed. And it's truly emblematic of the viewpoint of a significant portion of the South.
Yeah,
Like
there are
to
several. Yeah,
to
yeah,
have that mentality and to be able to even act upon that, it's disturbing beyond all belief, and people will get offended by this, people will get upset by this, people say, oh well, the war wasn't like this, it's about southern pride, or any coping mechanism that they can devise. But at the end of the day, innocent people were enslaved, innocent people were killed, innocent people lost their lives. And while I don't condone what Sherman had done, you look at that and it's hard to stand idly by seeing people treated in that manner.
yeah. Not to mention, this is the fourth year of the war, and if you look at any of the previous Confederate victories, especially in Virginia, where they won a lot of them, uh, just ask what happened to all the surrendered black regiments from the Union. The
Yeah.
answer is gunfire.
And not to mention that both the Confederates and the Union utilized black soldiers in their fights, and most times you can tell where they ended up because it was at the front of the charge.
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely a sense of expendability based on skin color from both sides here. But yeah, yeah, the Confederacy did have a history of refusing to accept the surrender of any black soldier and instead killing them, which happens here to the civilians attempting to be escorted to safety at Ebenezer Creek. Um, However, after Ebenezer Creek, there is the taking of Savannah. Sherman has all but made it to his final destination, and with the bridge destroyed, Wheeler can't get there in time to stop him. Sherman arrives in Savannah on December the 12th. Now, Savannah is in a marshland, and its defenses have been heavily enhanced to take advantage of the marshy terrain. This does not bode well for Savannah. As strong as its defenses are, Sherman is Sherman. He makes short work of it. Sherman sends 4,000 men to take Fort McAllister on December the 13th. Now, McAllister is the centerpiece for Savannah's defense. It's the primary fortification for the city. It's a military fortress. It boasts 230 cannons and a 20 cannons and a 230 man garrison. 230 cannons would be a hell of a lot. But yes, 20 cannons, 230 men, and you have to charge up a single path through mud to get to it. Sherman took it in 15 minutes.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. It was a single charge, frontal assault, 130 Union dead, 40 Confederate dead. And with the taking of Fort McAllister, Savannah is completely encircled by land. Sherman demands the surrender of Savannah 4 days later on December the 17th. This demand is immediately rejected. This is because the Confederate forces there are preparing an evacuation. They abandoned the city on the night of December the 20th and 21st to go and fight in South Carolina. They head for Charlottesville, I believe. Fun fact, Sherman heads that way too once he takes the city.
Ooh.
Sherman does not like people getting away.
Yeah, he's got that kind of vibe.
I do love Sherman's response to taking the city, though, because he telegraphed President Lincoln offering him the city and its intact arsenal as a Christmas present.
Yep. To which anyone who knows anything about Abraham Lincoln, as glad as he would be that the city of Savannah surrendered on the 21st without a fight and that the Union has all these new weapons and stuff that the Confederacy can no longer use, Lincoln would not be ecstatic about this sort of thing as a Christmas present. Here, Lincoln, I got you this city I sacked. Like, Lincoln hated the war. He hated the tragedy of it. Lincoln would not be happy.
I don't know, because at that point, that very much is like you definitely at this point, at the point that Savannah fell, you can really see the war was ending. The war was almost over. Yeah. So him sending that was kind of a little boastful, in my opinion, but it was not without a pretty good justification of, hey, look, we're almost at the end here. We just got done sacking this last major city.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Speaking of sacking the city, that's going to bring us to the end of Sherman's march, but not to the end of this episode, because we get to talk about the impact of this march, because we've kind of gone through and we've listed some battles and done a general discussion of some of the myths and tragedies and tactics that were involved. But now that we're at the end of that, it's time for the final count. And we will start, as is fitting with a war, with the body count.
Always a good one.
Yeah. Of the 62,000 Union soldiers Sherman deployed on the march, 1,300 fell. Of the Confederate forces deployed both in terms of militia and under General Wheeler's cavalry, 2,300 are dead, marking a numerical victory in the terms of lost manpower for the Union. Yay. We killed people.
Union.
I mean, as long as that number is in that direction, you're...
Yeah.
It's war, but as long as you're in the positives.
Yep. Now, between 17,000 and 25,000 black people were freed along the march as a direct result of Union troops coming by your plantation, shooting the person keeping you held in bondage, and freeing you. An additional 7,500 people were freed with the taking of Savannah. Because, fun fact, a army fleeing in the dead of night does not exactly have the ability to abduct several thousand people.
That's true, yeah.
So, okay, how many people died at Ebenezer Creek, estimated?
Let me check. Because that was my thing.
Because we're looking at roughly 30,000 or so freed slaves.
Yeah.
Enslaved people.
I'm going around. There's a bunch of flags to it. I've rarely seen an exact number, which is why one is not included. On this, however, there was a public outcry regarding the deaths, even though the exact number cannot seem to be reported. There was so much outcry on it that President Lincoln, in January of 1865, approved the redistribution of 400,000 acres of coastal property outside Savannah to freed black slaves.
Oh, well, that's good, at least.
He approved an eminent domain of 400,000 acres of coastal property to the freed slaves in response to the public outcry to what happened at Ebenezer Creek.
I'm not going to talk about the fact that at this point in time that was some of the least valuable land, but it's still a good gesture. Because it was the least arable and it was the least agriculturally viable lands.
Yeah. The death toll in the one thing I have here, I did find it again, is estimated to be at about 5,000 dead civilians.
Ooh, so that's like a 20 to 25% mark for the amount that they freed versus the amount that died.
Yeah. Um,
Ooh, that's a tough one.
that's a tough one. Yeah, no, the Wheeler takes vengeance on behalf of the spirit of the Confederate States of America for the act of freeing all these slaves. He
Yeah,
takes vengeance.
yeah, they
Uh,
definitely were out for blood.
yeah. Uh, Sherman reports $100 million in damages to Confederate infrastructure. Now, in 21st century money, that's about 1.5 billion.
Oh, jeez. This man single-handedly crippled an entire like section of the country.
Yep. The damage this man
Effectively.
does to the South's agricultural output has been measured as lasting until the 1920s.
It
Whew.
took a whole
It
world
takes
war.
Yeah.
it takes the end of World War One and the massive industrial boon that is for the South to recover.
And not to mention the Roaring Twenties is what finally pulled them out.
Yeah.
Ugh.
Didn't so much pull them out, but brought them back on par to where they were 80 years prior.
I mean, to some degree,
60 years prior.
they handicapped themselves because they had a lot of Jim Crow laws, which disenfranchised a lot of their large black populations,
Which
and
literally could have been
Reconstruction.
used. Like, they could have been like an integral part of society, like in name and in practice, but they chose to be petty.
And then also on the same token, the Reconstruction era policy has not really held up to modern day scrutiny. We look back
Yep.
at it, and it was just a series of blunder after blunder.
Yep. Yep.
But
Now,
1.5 billion.
yeah. Yeah. And it did achieve its goal. It split the Confederacy in half. Um, Mass desertions occur among the Army of Northern Virginia following news of the march. Now, the Army of Northern Virginia was the Confederacy's main fighting force. These are the people at Fredericksburg and Richmond. These are the people tied to very famous, very successful Southern generals. And they lose hope and just start deserting when they hear that Georgia has been burned to the ground.
Well,
Because what's the point? They're fighting in Richmond and Fredericksburg to keep the Union out of the South. And yet the Union just went into the heartland and burned it.
yeah, it's insane, and I guess this might be a good point for us to highlight my favorite story personally, one
Yep.
that we
Yep.
are all kind of close to. We
Yep.
are all alumni of Illinois State University, who their very first president,
Red
Charles
Berets.
Hovey, had established the university in 1857, and by the time that the war broke out, he had a mass amount of students who wanted to drop out of school and go march in the war. Well, he made a deal with them, and like a man of his word, his promise was that if every single student had passed their final exams and had finished their coursework, he would join them and march off to the war. So
Yep.
Hovey managed to muster an entire infantry unit, the 33rd Illinois, and was full of students, teachers, and the university president marching off to the war. And he and the students joined in the March to the Sea.
Yeah.
To the
Yeah, that was the campaign he took part in, and you will refer to him as Brevet Major General. He is buried in Arlington National Cemetery for his ability to rally an army full of educated individuals with leadership skills into the Union Army.
Damn right he could.
It's a interesting connection. It's kind of interesting to see how a student went, and also the few other things that are kind of notable about Hovey is He was a contemporary to Lincoln in Illinois at this time. Lincoln was a frequent visitor to Bloomington Normal, which had the David Davis, who was a close colleague with Lincoln and visited frequently. Lincoln had done his law practice in McLean County there, so there were a lot of interactions, and it was kind of a he earned his promotion. He earned it in the field. It was a field promotion, but the connections with Illinois and the Civil War are phenomenal.
And just because you brought up the name with Lincoln visiting, David Davis was a lawyer who had a manor in Bloomington Normal in Illinois, who would later come to sit on the U.S. Supreme Court.
I think it was the federal Supreme Court. I don't think it was just the Illinois.
Yeah, no, it was the federal Supreme Court.
I said U.S. Supreme Court.
You said Illinois.
I said who lived in Illinois.
Okay.
Let's play back the tape. People in the comments, who is right?
Come to his aid.
And let me know why it's me. But yes, David Davis was a Supreme Court justice who was good friends with Abe Lincoln, and not only Grant, but 8 other Union generals come from the town of Galena, Illinois. So
Yeah. Lincoln's people rallied to save him from this war. the Illinois
Douglas, bastard.
Yep. The Americans of Illinois. Not the actual Illinois, the Americans of Illinois.
But it's kind of interesting, and it goes to show kind of the vast swaths of locations and people come from. I mean,
yeah.
Sheesh. And then we talked about it a little bit earlier, but this is very much one of the first examples of modern total warfare.
Yeah.
We very much have to highlight the modern part, because people are like, well, what about the sacking of Troy, or God forbid, any other historical example.
Anytime anyone has ever set foot in Russia.
True.
Oh,
this is
time to call an ambulance, but not for me.
This was deliberate. There was deliberate target of civilians, literally, like property and infrastructure destroyed systematically.
Yeah, because the focus of this, the reason why this is total war is the focus wasn't on obtaining objectives or holding ground. It was on causing as much psychological trauma to a civilian population as could possibly be inflicted. Like, I'm pretty sure if Sherman had dogs, he would have just set them loose.
It was at a point in the war, almost 4 years in, that the cost, the toll had really started taking effect on people, and this was a next level up. This shows just how much further this could go, because up until this point, the war was pretty back and forth. There were some major victories on both sides, but there wasn't a clear and decisive end in sight. As messed up as this really was the catalyst for the end.
Yeah,
that morale victory, not moral. It's not moral at all.
Yeah, no, there is no morality here. But the end does come six months after the sacking of Savannah, with General Robert E. Lee's surrender to the Union. Now, Lee's surrender effectively ended both the war and the Confederacy. There were some people in Texas who really didn't get the message. And that is in part because communications, and in part because it's Texas.
Yeah, Texas.
Yeah, that's another story. Waiting a full year after the full emancipation end of the war to actually tell your slaves. God damn you.
I mean, it's on par. I mean, it's on brand for Texas, considering their whole reason for their independence from Mexico was to keep their slaves.
Now, the good news is that the surrender comes 6 months after Sherman takes Savannah, which means that when Sherman goes to South Carolina, he really doesn't have a lot of time to set anything on fire. He does try to. Sherman personally hated South Carolina. South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union. They were the first state to form the Confederacy. they were kind of the mother of all the woes of this Civil War.
They fired on Fort
Yet,
Sumter.
yep. And as such, Sherman, being a staunch Unionist, absolutely blamed them for every single life lost.
Oh.
And he tried to take it out on them, but Lee surrendered in time. And I say surrendered in time, but I mean, you gave him only half a year to get there.
Yeah, he didn't have enough time to get the wheels of the military industrial complex going, but it's just it's one of those things, and it's something that military historians and military strategists argue with a lot of at what point do the means justify the ends. At
Uh,
what point
yeah,
is
it's
it
just
worth doing something so severe, so extreme, and is it worth the cost?
Yeah.
And there's no definitive answer, and that's
Yeah.
really the bottom line of the ethical debate or the moral debate of it is there is no there is no definitive answer because had the Union not taken Savannah, had the Union not taken Atlanta, had they not taken Milledgeville,
Mhm.
oh, I always mess that one up. Had they
Yeah.
not taken these major cities and cut off those supply lines, the South could have still kept exporting food. They could have exported cotton. They could have exported these goods and maintained their coffers to at least keep the war going. Because the whole goal for the South in this war was they were never going to take over the Union. They wanted a war of attrition and to wear down the Union enough that the Union gave up.
Yeah. Yeah, it is like the American Revolutionary War. It was a war of independence, which means that you are not trying to remove another country from a map, but rather trying to force that country to acknowledge you as a sovereign, separate entity. Um, that was the win condition for the South, was cost the Union so many human lives that they deem that holding on to Virginia is just not worth it.
And by the end of the war, that cost was nearly 750,000 lives.
Yeah,
yeah.
At a
yeah,
point when the U.S.'s population was under, what, 50 million, 40 million?
that's a good question.
It wasn't very big. And I even think that those guesstimations are quite oversized. I think it.
Uh, yeah, yeah. So the numbers is it's considered the Union proper had 18.5 million, the
Okay.
Confederacy had 5.5 million, and the border states held about 2.5 million.
So, roughly doing some head math, you're talking 25 to 27 million people total. And
Yeah,
that's a huge cost. You're talking
yeah, about yeah,
almost a what?
yeah, 750,000 out of about 26 million. Um, that's about 3% of the population, little less.
And that's not to account for the closer to what 1.5 or 1.8 million who were actually involved in the war. That was just
Yeah,
casualties.
yeah,
You're not talking the soldiers. You're not talking the people that worked in in the complex, the women that started working in factories. Because we like
mhm.
to think of Rosie the Riveter as one of the first examples of women joining the workforce to aid in the military war complex, but that's not the case.
Yeah. No, she's just the one that made it famous, and and about the time when the practice stuck of women can do work.
Well, and that also
Yeah.
tied into I think it was first wave feminism, second wave, maybe second wave
It went for
It'd be
them.
second. First wave was the 20s with
suffragette. Yeah.
amendments and suffrages.
Okay, so that was second wave feminism, but yeah, it was a huge market point, and it really shaped how the U.S. was perceived because the only other country, major, I should say, major colonial slaveholding state at this point was Brazil, and Brazil held on for like another 20 years, to the point where a bunch of Confederates left the United States and moved to Brazil to start a slave colony down there because it was still legal.
Yeah, the Confederate town in Brazil is a wonderfully interesting thing. It's a very fun anthropological study watching them have their corn festival down there, and like, honestly, it's weird seeing them celebrate the good old boys and the good old days, and not like actively harassing black people.
Up until very, very recently, they would host parades where they would fly flags, fly the stars and bars, and just overall celebrate the Confederacy. But that
They
has
still
since
have an
stopped.
annual celebration.
But
It's
the parade
terrible.
has stopped. They have stopped
Yeah.
doing
Oh,
public celebrations. There is outcry in Brazil. But I
yeah.
think that's actually a great point for us to wrap up on today's episode. It has been a roller coaster. It has been a grog, and now we know that educators helped raise Atlanta, and I think that's
No,
poetic.
we didn't raise Atlanta, but we did sack Savannah.
I think
Well,
that's a good point, Dad.
yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Peace.
Yep.
Oh wait.